There is a quiet moment inside you, a moment you rarely notice when your breath softens and your mind stops defending itself. In that instant, something ancient inside you remembers that reality is not fixed, that life is not a sequence of accidents, and that your inner state is not merely a mood but an instruction to the universe. Let yourself settle into that space as you listen, not by forcing stillness, but by allowing the noise to fall away naturally, like dust drifting off a window that was always meant to let the light in. What you are about to understand is not a technique, and it is not a promise. It is a doorway, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Maybe you've been carrying the weight of trying so hard to believe, trying to hold faith for long enough, trying to silence the part of you that keeps asking, what if it doesn't work for me? You're not wrong for feeling this. You're human, and you've been shaped by years of scarcity, disappointment, and subtle emotional patterns that told you to expect difficulty. You've stretched yourself in both directions, hope on one side, fear on the other, and somewhere in the middle you got tired of feeling moments of expansion followed by hours of collapse, tired of seeing small signs but no transformation, tired of believing today only to doubt tomorrow. That exhaustion is not a flaw. It is simply the aftertaste of living with an inner state that keeps contradicting what your mind says it wants. Neville Goddard hinted at something few people truly practice, a short window of unwavering inner certainty, a brief period where you no longer oscillate between desire and fear, where you stop checking, stop doubting, stop bargaining with the invisible. He taught that your assumption, once accepted, does not need to be held forever. It only needs to be held consistently long enough for the world to reorganize around it. But the human mind rarely allows that. It sabotages belief through micro-doubts, subtle emotional contractions, habitual scanning for signs of failure, and the quiet expectation that something will go wrong because something has gone wrong before. You've felt it, that small inward flinch when things seem too good, the gentle recoil when a desire feels too big, the hesitation before trusting your own vision. These tiny fractures are what weaken the bridge between your intention and your identity. Underneath all of this is a hidden longing. You don't merely want blessings, you want confirmation that you are not delusional for believing in them. You want something to happen quickly so you know you're not fooling yourself. You crave a sign, not because you lack intelligence or depth, but because you've spent years being told, directly and indirectly, that your inner world has no power, and yet you feel something inside you whispering the opposite. You want a method that brings proof, but you fear the disappointment of hoping again. You want to trust life, but your past taught you to protect yourself by expecting less. This is where the 24-hour experiment lives, not in wishful thinking, not in emotional intensity, but in psychological and energetic coherence. Joe Dispenza explains that when you hold a single elevated internal state long enough for the nervous system to stop contradicting it, you begin to rewire the pathways that dictate your habitual emotions. You stop anticipating loss. You stop reenacting old memories. You stop projecting fear into the unknown, and your biology begins to match the identity you've been too afraid to claim. This is not mystical exaggeration. It is neuroplasticity. It is emotional conditioning. It is the spiritual truth that identity is the magnet of your reality. So understand this. The 24-hour stance is not blind belief. It is conscious assumption. It is choosing for one single day to inhabit the version of you for whom blessings are normal, expected, unquestioned. It is not about feeling high-frequency emotions every second. It's about refusing to collapse back into the identity that keeps postponing your life. It is a temporary identity shift, deep enough and steady enough that your inner world stops contradicting what you desire. And when contradiction stops, synchronicity begins, opportunities appear, people shift, timing aligns. Not because the universe suddenly decides to be generous, but because you finally stopped sending mixed signals. Let this moment settle into your body. Notice how your chest expands just slightly when you imagine 24 hours of certainty. Notice how your nervous system relaxes when you realize you don't need to hold it forever, just long enough for truth to take root. You are not entering a challenge. You are entering a new posture, a new breath, a new sense of self. You are stepping into a day where life responds not to your effort, but to your assumption. This is the doorway Neville pointed toward, the one most people never walk through. Today, you do. There is a quiet tension that lives between what you say you believe and what you actually feel as you move through your day. You might wake in the morning with a spark of hope, imagining a life aligned with abundance, ease, and divine timing. But then, a familiar heaviness returns as you check your phone, look at your bank balance, or remember an old pattern repeating again. That soft collapse inside you is not weakness. It is the echo of an emotional identity that has not yet caught up with your intention. You hold the vision mentally, but inside your chest, a different self is still steering the way you breathe, judge, anticipate, and react. People try to think positive, but the body remembers the past far more loudly than the mind imagines the future. That is the hidden blockade, a belief in your head layered on top of uncertainty in your emotional posture. Neville Goddard often reminded us that assumption is not thought, it is identity. It is the inner tone you carry without realizing it, the tone that whispers, "This is who I am, and this is what life gives me." Bruce Lipton would say your subconscious patterns shape 95% of your daily responses before the conscious mind has time to intervene. When the identity you've been conditioned to inhabit contradicts the life you are trying to create, the blessing does not fail because the universe ignores you. It simply has nowhere to land. This is the rarely discussed truth. Blessings stall not because you doubt them intellectually, but because your body continues to express a self that expects difficulty, interruption, delay, or disappointment. That internal mismatch creates identity state dissonance, a subtle but powerful form of self-opposition. And here is the part that frees you instead of discouraging you. You don't need a stronger belief. You don't need more affirmations or more visualization time or more emotional intensity. What you need is coherence, a soft alignment between the you who imagines and the you who breathes. Coherence is the moment when the internal voice saying, "It's mine," finally sounds more familiar than the voice saying, "Be careful." It's when your chest no longer tightens at the idea of receiving. It's when your nervous system stops interpreting blessings as exceptions. This is why the 24-hour experiment works. It gives you a short, sacred frame where you allow identity and intention to finally agree. To begin shifting that inner tension, you don't need a long ritual. You need one clear minute, a moment Neville would recognize instantly as the seed of assumption. The identity realignment. Minute is simple but powerful. For 60 seconds, imagine yourself as someone for whom blessings are normal, not extraordinary. See yourself walking, breathing, thinking, and responding as if goodness is expected, not earned. Let your shoulders rest in the posture of someone who knows they are supported. Let your internal dialogue soften into the tone of someone whose life flows. When that identity even briefly becomes the most familiar voice in the room, your body begins to learn a new emotional reference point. Neuroplasticity doesn't require hours. It requires consistency of tone, even in small amounts, for the nervous system to shift. Imagine your identity like a lens. Even the brightest light becomes distorted if the glass is cracked. A cracked lens does not reject the light. It simply warps the truth of what it reflects. In the same way, blessings have always been around you, but your inner lens determined how you interpreted them. If you saw delay, it was the lens. If you saw inconsistency, it was the lens. If you saw a little progress followed by a setback, it was the lens. When the lens begins to heal, even slightly, the light that was always present finally becomes clear, steady, and recognizable. That clarity is what the 24-hour experiment ignites. It teaches your inner world to stop bending the truth of your own power. When you feel the resonance of this, even faintly, you begin to sense that nothing has been missing from your path. The missing piece was the version of you that receives, and that version is awakening. There is something subtle that moves beneath your thoughts, something so quiet you barely recognize it as doubt. It doesn't appear dramatically, and it doesn't shout, "This won't work." It shows up as a brief tightening in the stomach when you imagine receiving more than you're used to. It shows up as that tiny pause before you trust a good opportunity. It shows up in the way your mind scans your environment, almost unconsciously looking for signs that something might fall apart. Most people think their issue is a big, obvious fear, but the truth is far gentler and far more cunning. It is the accumulation of micro-doubts, dozens of small, unspoken hesitations that quietly pull you back to the person you used to be. They don't sound loud enough to worry about, yet they shape your emotional baseline, your assumptions, and the way your energy speaks to life. Joe Dispenza would call this the survival brain doing what it believes keeps you safe. Whenever your inner state raises toward abundance, the old neural pathways activate, asking, is this believable? Is this safe? Is this realistic? These questions don't show up as sentences. They show up as subtle contractions. That is the essence of the micro-skepticism theory. The smallest internal doubts can trigger the emotional memory of scarcity. And once that memory awakens, it starts interpreting even neutral situations as threats or losses. You've likely experienced this without noticing. A delay in a message becomes a sign of rejection. A small unexpected expense becomes evidence of misalignment. Silence becomes danger. All of this happens because micro-doubt tilts your perception toward fear, not because the world is actually turning against you. What makes this even more delicate is that a single repeated micro-thought can undo an entire day of strong intention. Not because the thought has power on its own, but because repetition gives it emotional authority. You might spend your morning visualizing abundance, then have one brief moment of, what if this doesn't happen? And that whisper returns throughout the day like a quiet echo. Each recurrence weakens the emotional certainty you built earlier. It's not dramatic, but it's effective. Doubt doesn't need to be loud to interrupt manifestation. It only needs to be consistent. This is why people feel stuck even when they pray, affirm, visualize, or meditate. They are planting seeds with one hand while unconsciously pulling them up with the other. To interrupt this subtle inner sabotage, you don't need to fight your thoughts. You only need presence. The moment you feel that faint contraction, the shift in breath, the soft emotional dip that accompanies a doubtful micro-thought, pause internally for just a few seconds. This brief interception breaks the unconscious loop that would normally repeat throughout the day. Dispenza explains that interrupting a conditioned emotional pattern creates a moment of neuroplastic possibility. The brain becomes receptive to a new identity. When you create that small gap, you invite the possibility of a self that doesn't cling to fear as a default response. You begin teaching your nervous system that certainty is safe, that trust is normal, and that you no longer need to analyze your blessings before receiving them. Imagine your inner state like a ship sailing toward a destination. The ship doesn't sink because of one large wave. It sinks because of a small unnoticed opening beneath the surface. Micro-doubt is that opening. It slowly drains the emotional stability you've been building, and by the time you notice the leak, you feel like you're struggling to believe again. But the beauty of this metaphor is that once the hole is sealed, the ship doesn't need to be rebuilt. It simply rises. It becomes buoyant again. It continues its path effortlessly because the structure was never broken. Only the container needed to be closed. When you begin to sense the nature of these tiny doubts, you stop blaming yourself for not manifesting faster and start understanding the quiet, emotional mechanics of your inner world. You realize that your power was never lost. It was diluted. And once dilution ends, your energy concentrates, your identity strengthens, your certainty deepens. And blessings that once seemed distant begin to gather near you, waiting for the moment your inner vessel stops leaking the faith you've been trying so hard to hold. There is a quiet misunderstanding many people carry, often without realizing it. The idea that belief requires constant emotional intensity, that in order for a desire to take shape, they must live in a heightened state of passion or gratitude from sunrise to sunset. This expectation becomes a burden, an invisible weight that convinces them they are failing every time their emotions dip or their energy softens. But human beings are not machines of eternal excitement. Neville never asked you to maintain an emotional peak. He asked you to sustain an inner acceptance. Acceptance is steady, not dramatic. Yet so many people exhaust themselves chasing emotional fireworks, believing that manifestation only works if they feel powerful every single moment. This is the hidden blockade, the idea that belief must be sustained endlessly, passionately, perfectly. The truth, however, is far gentler. The human mind does not rewire itself through intensity. It rewires through consistency. Joe Dispenza describes this through what can be understood as the cognitive compression model, a principle suggesting that short, unbroken periods of coherent belief influence identity more quickly than long stretches of inconsistent hope. You have likely experienced this in your own life. A single hour of deep, peaceful certainty transforms you more than weeks of fluctuating optimism. This is because the nervous system responds to emotional continuity, not emotional volume. A brief window of inner steadiness tells the subconscious, "This is who we are now," and the subconscious begins restructuring your emotional responses to match that identity. There is an inversion here that liberates you the moment you understand it. Belief doesn't need to last forever. It only needs to last long enough to overwrite the emotional program that contradicts it. You don't need to stay certain for months. You don't even need to stay certain for a week. What shifts your life is a short, sacred period where nothing inside you argues with your desire. This is what the 24-hour belief lock creates. A temporary container where your energy stops oscillating, where you are no longer pulled between hope and doubt, where your inner dialogue rests inside the tone of someone who already lives inside their blessing. When you stop demanding emotional intensity and focus instead on emotional coherence, belief becomes easy. It becomes natural. It becomes unforced. The method itself is simple. Choose a 24-hour block where you walk, breathe, respond, and assume from the identity of someone whose blessings are already unfolding. Not dramatically, not with forced joy, simply with a quiet inner knowing that says, "This is my life now." During this window, you no longer engage with the old identity that expects delay or disappointment. You no longer negotiate with fear. You no longer question the process. You shift from asking for blessings to being the person who blessings gather around. That shift, even for one day, imprints a new emotional reference point into your nervous system, allowing the brain to reorganize its patterns around a stable identity rather than a fluctuating desire. Think of lightning. The flash you see is instantaneous, but the charge that creates it builds quietly, invisibly, over time. The air fills with potential. The field aligns. The pressure stabilizes into a point of inevitability, and then all at once the sky opens. Your blessings function the same way. They may seem sudden, miraculous, or unexpected, but the inner charge leading to them formed over a short period of uninterrupted identity alignment. The moment your inner state becomes singular, unbroken, unquestioned, uncluttered, life has no choice but to respond, not because you forced it, but because you matched it. When the 24-hour belief lock becomes real for you, even just once, you begin to understand why Neville spoke so often about feeling the wish fulfilled as a state of being, not a moment of visualization. You begin to see that transformation does not require a lifetime of discipline. It requires one clear day where you stop returning to who you used to be. One day where your inner world holds its posture. One day where the blessing is not a desire, but an identity. And once identity changes, everything else follows. There is a moment, subtle but unmistakable, that tends to appear right before your reality begins to shift. It is not a surge of excitement, nor a sign of obvious progress. It is a quiet heaviness, a sudden return of old emotions, an unexpected wave of fatigue, discouragement, or detachment. Most people interpret this as regression, as if something inside them has collapsed, or the blessing has slipped away. But this emotional withdrawal is not a setback. It is the final resistance of an identity that knows its time is ending. You've experienced this before without knowing its meaning. You felt aligned, hopeful, connected, and suddenly a familiar sadness or fear rose out of nowhere. You thought something went wrong, yet nothing was wrong. Something inside you was loosening. Bruce Lipton would explain this phenomenon as the nervous system trying to cling to its old programming. The brain prefers what is familiar, even if it is painful, because familiarity feels safer than the unknown. When you begin assuming a new identity, one rooted in abundance, self-worth, and inner certainty, the old identity senses its dissolution, and like any structure about to crumble, it shakes. This is the essence of neuroplastic recoil, the temporary intensification of old emotions at the precise moment they are losing power. The very discomfort you interpret as failure is actually the evidence that the old emotional blueprint is destabilizing. It is not returning, it is releasing. The twist, the paradox that transforms everything, is that the dip you fear is the proof you're closest to a breakthrough. When you feel that sudden heaviness, your mind often tries to make meaning out of it, assuming something didn't work or that your belief wasn't strong enough. But emotional withdrawal happens not because your blessing is far away, but because it is near. The subconscious strains to pull you back into the identity it knows, the identity shaped by years of scarcity, caution, and emotional memory. Yet the pull is weaker than it feels. You are not regressing, you are shedding. And shedding rarely feels like expansion at first. It often feels like a sigh, a collapse, a moment where you think you've lost the frequency you worked so hard to hold. When this moment arises, the shift begins with recognition rather than reaction, a gentle inner acknowledgement that says, this heaviness is a release, not a warning. This allows the emotional wave to move through you without interpreting it as evidence against your manifestation. Joe Dispenza often teaches that the moment you see an old emotional pattern with awareness, you step out of the program and into consciousness. That brief awareness, nothing forced, nothing dramatic, creates space for your new identity to anchor itself. It is in this quiet pause, this simple recognition, that the emotional energy finally dissolves instead of repeating. The metaphor that brings clarity here is the bowstring. When an archer draws the string back, the tension peaks in the final moments before release. The resistance grows strongest just before the arrow flies. In the same way, your emotional tension intensifies not because you are failing, but because your inner world is preparing to launch you into a new reality. The pressure you feel is the final contraction before expansion. The heaviness is the last shadow before the opening. And the moment you stop resisting that feeling, the arrow is freed. When you understand this, your entire relationship with emotional dips transforms. You stop fearing them. You stop analyzing them. You begin to sense their sacred timing. You realize that your inner world is not falling apart. It is reorganizing itself. And in that reorganization, your blessing is already moving closer. There are moments when life is already shifting for you, yet you don't feel it. Not because blessings are absent, but because your attention is trained to anticipate what might go wrong. Years of protecting yourself have taught your mind to notice risk more quickly than opportunity. This is the quiet blockade. Your identity still expects difficulty, so it filters out subtle signs of support. The reticular assimilation principle explains this simply. Your brain highlights only what matches your assumed identity. When you see yourself as someone who must struggle, blessings appear invisible, not because they aren't happening, but because they don't fit the category your inner world is prepared to recognize. When certainty begins to settle, even briefly, perception shifts. You notice small alignments that were always present, a conversation that opens a path, a moment of ease where there was usually tension, a timing that feels unusually perfect. These are early blessings, not dramatic miracles. Joe Dispenza would describe them as the nervous system, finally attuning to a new emotional frequency. Once you stop expecting resistance, the world reveals its softness. Blessings are like stars. They never vanish. They simply cannot be seen when the inner light is too loud. When certainty returns even gently, visibility increases, and life begins to show you how supported you already are. There is a quiet longing within you that reaches for confirmation, a small impulse that asks, is it happening yet? You check your messages, your bank account, your signs, your circumstances, hoping for evidence that your inner work is taking shape. This habit doesn't come from weakness. It comes from years of uncertainty, years of feeling responsible for tracking every shift so nothing surprises you. Yet this constant checking subtly communicates that you do not trust the unfolding. It pulls you back into the identity that expects inconsistency. This is the hidden blockade. The very act of looking for proof dissolves the emotional certainty that creates it. Joe Dispenza explains this through the dopamine-seeking loop. When you repeatedly check for results, the brain enters a craving state, not a receiving state. You start looking for something external to soothe an internal doubt, and each moment you don't find what you expect, your faith weakens. Neville taught that assumption loses its creative power the moment you ask whether the seed is growing. The soil is disturbed, and the growth slows. The twist is simple but transformative. The need for signs is the block. When certainty settles, the checking stops on its own because the inner world feels complete. For the 24-hour experiment, stepping into the no-checking protocol, quietly, naturally, creates a different atmosphere inside you. You stop interpreting every moment. You stop scanning for signs. You let the energy breathe without interference. Blessings multiply in this space because assumption becomes uninterrupted. It's like water heating on the stove. The boiling comes faster when you stop lifting the lid. There is a quiet truth you begin to sense as you mature spiritually. The more you crave something, the farther it feels. Intense desire often hides a subtle fear, a feeling that what you want might slip away if you do not hold it tightly enough. This emotional tension signals to your nervous system that you are still separate from what you are seeking. That is the hidden blockade. You are imagining abundance while feeling the possibility of lack. Neville hinted at this when he said that true assumption carries no strain. It feels like a gentle settling, not an emotional sprint. A state of effective neutrality changes everything. It is not indifference, it is alignment without urgency. Joe Dispenza would describe it as the body entering coherence, where your breath, posture, and emotional tone move in the same direction. In this state, you are not reaching outward. You are inhabiting the identity of someone already connected to their blessing. Your shoulders soften, your breath deepens, the inner noise quiets, and without effort, your energy communicates consistency instead of longing. Think of a calm lake. When the water is still, it reflects the sky with clarity. Emotional neutrality works the same way. The quieter your inner world becomes, the more naturally blessings reflect themselves back to you. There comes a moment in every seeker's journey where the pursuit of high emotion becomes exhausting. You try to feel grateful, joyful, expansive, yet the more you push, the more artificial it feels. This pressure does not create alignment, it creates tension. The hidden blockade here is subtle. By trying to force elevated feelings, you signal to your body that those emotions are not naturally present. Your nervous system responds with resistance, and the emotional field tightens instead of opening. Joe Dispenza describes this as the effective rebound principle. When you attempt to manufacture an emotion, the body reacts by reinforcing the very state you are trying to escape. Neville understood this long before neuroscience gave it language. He taught that the creative act is rooted not in intensity, but in ease. The universe responds to the tone of your being, not the performance of your emotions. The twist is liberating. Natural assumption carries more power than the most dramatic gratitude practice. When you allow yourself to access just the smallest authentic sensation of being supported, a gentle warmth in the chest, a soft exhale, a subtle sense of, I'm held, your inner world begins to organize itself. That sincerity, even if faint, opens the door far more effectively than emotional force. Think of a swing in motion. A gentle push at the right moment creates more momentum than the strongest shove applied at the wrong time. In the same way, your smallest genuine feeling carries more creative power than the largest forced one. Change rarely arrives in steady steps. It comes in waves the moment your identity stops contradicting your desire. When you hold a coherent inner state, even briefly, life begins reorganizing with surprising speed. This is the identity cascade effect. Once alignment settles, opportunities cluster instead of appearing one by one. A message arrives at the right time, a path opens, a decision becomes effortless. These moments are not coincidences. They are reflections of an inner posture that finally matches what you've asked for. Like a snowball gathering momentum, each synchronicity builds upon the last, revealing how quickly reality moves when you allow it to. When the shift finally anchors, it doesn't arrive with intensity. It arrives as a calm that feels natural, almost inevitable. This stillness is the sign. Cognitive assimilation. Silence unfolds when your identity fully accepts the blessing, dissolving the urge to check or analyze. 3 markers appear almost at once: an ease in the body, a quiet clarity in the mind, and the absence of craving for proof. Nothing dramatic happens, yet everything feels already settled. That quiet certainty is embodiment. One day of unbroken belief can reshape your entire destiny. A single coherent state carries more power than years of scattered effort. Neville taught that one sustained assumption reshapes the field, and Dispenza confirms the brain reorganizes when inner conflict ends. For one day you become the self who receives naturally. In that identity, life quietly rearranges itself around you.